After watching the Little Mermaid remake, I decided to go back and watch the only Disney film that actually worked in this entire genre. I mean, granted, there are ones I still consider to be good, with the likes of The Jungle Book and Maleficent, because they were ones that actually take their stories in a different, non-destructive direction, but not as much as what Cinderella did. Because today, Cinderella remains to be the only Disney live-action remake that has worked and has continued to work to this day. And this video is meant to explain why exactly this is compared to the many other remakes that have came out that has constantly betrayed the original purpose of their very stories. Now granted, there are some problems I have with this film, which are actually minor and just comes from the fact that it is a remake, but there are many more positives to this story to be actually discussed that adds on to the 1950 original counterpart that actually saved Disney during that very time. Where looking back onto both films, they actually added to the best parts of the story rather than remove it for the sake of making it worse, which is honestly still baffling to me to this day. But not as much as the fact that this movie was actually directed by Kenneth Branagh, who has also made one of the worst Disney films ever in Artemis Fowl, which has ironically been removed from Disney Plus entirely at this point during their purge of content. And even more worse is the fact that every other Disney remake is on Disney Plus too, except for Maleficent and Cinderella on there, which they did have it on there, but that is all due to the pre-existing contracts that they have to fulfill, where now they leave the worst ones to rot on their own surface and the best shelled out to someone else. The best thing about this movie that the other remakes failed to offer is its runtime. It's about 27 minutes longer counting the credits than the original film, where it actually realizes what exactly it needs to do for a movie that is a remake and takes more liberties, which is in comparison to Aladdin and The Lion King and of course The Little Mermaid, adding this extra hour of absolutely nothing to the entire film, compared to this one which adds just enough to the backstory and to some characters to flesh out its pacing, and it works. It doesn't need to do too much that actually is almost the same as the original runtime, where it understands what it is as a movie, one that is also more colorful than all of the current films combined, surprisingly doing everything right that a remake should do or is perceived to do, and that is what I'm going to show you. Because as we all know, the original story of Cinderella was a simple one about an orphan girl raised by her abusive stepfamily, but by the grace of her fairy godmother, gets this chance to go out and shine, which she finally catches the attention of the prince. They fall in love, she disappears, they send out a search for the girl who fits the glass slipper, they find her, and they live happily ever after. It's very simple and doesn't do a whole lot, leaving much more to the desired in the story for the characters, mainly focusing on Cinderella herself, and this subplot of Lucifer and the mice for some reason, where you can still get why it's a great time and why it still worked to save Disney for such a beautiful animation it did. But then again, this remake actually does a lot more in the story department that is to be expected, and this starts back at the beginning with this particular remake, where it presents something more fleshed out and actual real like these films are actually supposed to be. In the beginning of the original film, it establishes Cinderella's background being raised by her widowed father, who eventually passes, leaving her under the care of her wicked stepmother and bratty stepsisters, becoming a domestic servant for them because of her very beauty over them. This is where they expand upon that part by having her named Ella instead and showing her living a good vibrant life with her mother and father, how they were good loving parents raising a child who takes care of the animals greatly, talking to them. And the great thing about this is how compared to other Disney live action films is how they don't really rely on the animals too greatly. Sure, the small ones like the mice and like Jock and Gus are actually CGI, but they don't rely on them having to talk like in the original or having a greater role to focus on the human characters instead. They still help out overall in the plot in various scenes, but the movie justifies this in a more consistent, somewhat realistic manner over their expressive tone of the animated films where she interacts and talks with them. It does enough to convince you that they are still justified in her story without focusing on them too hard, where it becomes jarring like what The Little Mermaid has produced recently, or overall the stiffness of The Lion King, where this is way more expressive than that film could ever do. But the main point about this scene is it putting the emphasis on Ella and her mother and of course her father, whom they all love each other so dearly. It's done in this way compared to other remakes that adds more to the weight of her character's background by having those figures in her life rather than showcasing one solitary moment in the narration that she had this but didn't when she was 19 under her very stepfamily. This is important to establish the main theme for her character and the only real song that they actually sing in the entire film being Lavender's Blue instead of the original songs of the film itself. This particular song was a folk song that Disney themselves actually revived way back in 1948 for their film So Dear to My Heart, and brought it back here where its lyrics actually reflect on the story story better and the relationship she has, as we see later on in the film, where it is put here in the beginning as a lullaby her mother sang to her and the relationship that they go for, something that gets strengthened over time with the meaning that it tries to present. This is also the moment where her mother also gets sick and changes the course of the story and its themes, where she leaves Ella to have courage and be kind. Very simple yet powerful few words that reflects on Cinderella's character and makes her a strong female protagonist, even more so than all of the other remakes that fail to empower them today. And so over the years we actually see Ella grow up with her father, taking her mother's words to heart, where more than the original they actually explain how her father met Lady Tremaine, who also became a widow at the same time, where he asked Ella for a blessing to be happy again in a relationship, putting more weight on her character's decisions and of course the relationship between her and her father, accepting this decision so that he can be happy. It adds a beautiful amount that wasn't explored before so that we could see the setup the world that we find ourselves in, rather than putting us in the situation without any setup in the beginning, where that is why in some cases it is a better film for Cinderella and shows us Lady Tremaine, Drizella, and Anastasia's introduction to further cement the world's facts. I mean, the best part about this introduction is the fact that Lucifer is a real cat, and like the mice in the story, he isn't in it a whole lot like the original, and that's great compared to like Pinocchio that animated their cat for some reason, where Disney now likes to forget that they could actually use real animals in reference to that and still have an overall great story with them as they do here. I mean, you are convinced he is the same threat, but that's to put more emphasis on Lady Tremaine's personality and character, which I think Cate Blanchett did a good job in portraying. I do like the sinister portrayal of the original during the animation, but there is more added to her here that gives you those hints about what she looks for in life for her and her very daughters, and finding that through Ella's father. This is where her father has to leave for business and encourages on as much as her mother did, knowing that she's still with her in her spirit and heart that she always had, where Lady Tremaine looks on at this opportunity. It establishes her jealousy for Ella shown here, where it showcases her tyrannical nature against her to move up into the attic, showing us the beginning of her control over her and everything in her life. The things we already see in the original film, where she already is in the role as a servant, and that's really great to see how this is happening over time in these scenes rather than explained to us in the prologue, to show us that actual events to make us sympathize with our main character in Cinderella. And this is where it finally hits her when the news of her father's death comes from abroad. We see this impact her more, losing the only two people who loved her, cementing the control of Lady Tremaine and her stepsisters. The fact she's lost everything at this moment except her stepfamily, letting the other staff go to save money and having Ella do all the work instead as they were not needed anymore. It's where it finally catches up to the events similar to the original, where this is how you do the story right, adding the right amount of details that justifies the original story without ruining any of it in any way, to show us and sympathize with her character against the actions of her stepfamily. This is also where we finally get her named Cinderella because of the cinders that cover her face after sleeping by this fireplace, to show that the name actually just comes from the hatred of her stepfamily rather than just being named Cinderella just because, adding more weight to her character and the struggle she went through, the amount of abuse she got to this point that has allowed her to be dubbed this humiliating name despite remaining true to her mother's words for the majority of her life. This causes her to ride off in pain from these revelations, where it also introduces us to Prince Charming himself, renamed Kit to add more background to his very character, who in this scene was out there hunting with the other guard. This is in stark contrast to the original film that never even introduced us to his character until the ball, which is very late in the story in the original, where at this point it only showed the king who wanted his son to have a wife to continue his bloodline of the monarchy. Not really much for a story compared to just showing him now, where he hides the fact he is a prince from Ella, who just caught him on a stroll. This sets up a connection that really adds to why they're attracted to each other in the story, to explain a small bit about their background by having them interact this early on. It just adds more weight to Kit as a character rather than the original, to show us his motivations and story that needed to be focused on. It also leads us to focus more on his story, where I love Richard Madden's portrayal as the character that had no existence in the original until the actual third film that fleshed out his character more in the animation realm. This elaborates more on his relationship with his father, the king, establishing that he's very ill at this point, which the original actually didn't have at all, where he was just full of spirit wanting his son to get married. It sets up more weight to Kit's character, just questioning his newfound love for this mysterious girl he met, instead of him actually rushing at the chance that he got attracted to a girl to arrange a marriage. And this is all because of his illness that more justifies his reasons to immediately choose a bride, namely a princess, to be his wife at the time proposing the ball, introducing us to Stellan Skarsgård's version of the Grand Duke as well, where they portray him as more antagonistic in this film, who's focused more on his political desires for the kingdom rather than the choices of Kit, who is supposed to be king. This adds more than just the simple willful servant of the king in the original who helps Cinderella at the end, which is a good choice to actually further explore Kit's story. This brings us to the announcement of the ball, where all maidens are allowed to attend, which it follows similar to the original story of what happens, which is okay because it has been justified up to this point in doing so, knowing more in Ella's point of view, going back and forth of our two main characters actually thinking of each other. The choice to actually do this strengthens both of them as characters from their original and actually adds to the final decisions that we are actually experiencing in the film. This leads us to the night where she brings out her mother's dress to go to the ball, where it also removes that entire Lucifer and Jock and Gus sequence because it never needed to focus on that, putting it more on the emotional weight of the characters instead, which is much better for the story. Compared to the original, it actually puts more emphasis on Lady Tremaine's attitude against Ella, where she tears some of her dress instead of having originally let her daughters do it, showing us more of her own jealous attitude against her, degrading her in this way to project lies onto her so she could hold on to what power she has to fulfill herself. And I think that emotionally works better for her in this moment to be serious rather than the soft attitude of the original, just straight to her face and actually ruining her life because that is what she believes in as a person. The other two sisters are not that important, they are, but they're not, their weight isn't really put on there as much as Lady Tremaine's. This finally gets us to the fairy godmother, who appears at Ella's lowest point, and instead of appearing like a fairy would, she actually disguises herself as Ella as this old maiden, where she confirms to the audience in this scene that this is really her, as she is the actual film's narrator. The original actually appeared to comfort her, coming in her time of need, actually popping up like a fairy would, where this one actually works better to show that she's always been there watching in the background throughout her very life in the realistic sense of a fairy introduction. I don't have to explain much here because it's relatively the same scene from the original except for the fact that Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo isn't here, which it actually doesn't need to be for the film's tone. It just showcases her powers as is, and that's really fine, and it's great considering that they changed the mice into real life horses, which is another plus for this remake that uses more real live animals than the other ones, because come on, there should be no fake dogs or monkeys or cats. It just doesn't look good when there's actually real animals they could use, and ones they've already done so well in the past to actually further the story, to actually convince the audience that it works. But anyways, the dress transformation part here is actually done more beautifully than the original, more slow to introduce us and show us the beauty of the scene. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is one of the most iconic Disney scenes they have ever made, and the animation is really gorgeous and breathtaking, but the moment here really sells how important this change is for her, showcasing the slow transition of the color of the dress to be this beautiful blue, letting her dance around while keeping the same style that was her mother's as a tribute to her. It just showcases more weight to the decision and the transformation to sell her character to authenticate her beauty. This also leads us back to the ball, where Kit still argues a bit about his father about what he wanted, being the girl in the forest, while he still wants a princess instead to continue the royal lineage, where later on we see Ella enter the picture. This one works better because now everyone is actually focusing on her instead of having the prince look at her like, wow, look at this beauty for the very first time. Where now in this film we know the background he went through and sees her again. He's already met this character, much to his very delight and the shock of the crowd. It puts more weight on her character's focus now that everyone sees and the two of them now saying hello again. And of course, like the original, this is where they dance and all focus on them once again. I mean, they do that in the original film, but the weight of this scene is actually added now that this is presented us this way. The set design and the costumes here are very pretty and vibrant as the original, and you feel that. It is something that the newer ones don't get, and that truly baffles me on the lighting and color designs of these films, where this one actually proves that they actually can do it and it actually works. So once again, it is similar to the original where they spend time with each other, but adds more focus because she now knows he is a prince now before leaving, before she can say her name, knowing that the spell doesn't last forever. This scene also gets her in contact with the king, where she points out how much Kit loves his very father and how he's so brave and kind. It's a scene where it actually changes something about his opinion about his son once and adds more to his character rather than the dude of the king being jolly that he found a girl. Definitely more real and actually more better to me as a story story-wise. This leads to Lady Tremaine being suspicious of Ella, considering she looks similar to that girl that the prince was actually hanging out, keeping a watchful eye with her considering her infatuation and happy attitude when they all go back home. And it all takes place the night where Kit's father also dies. It shows his understanding and reflection from Ella's character about Kit's choices in his life to become his own man to make decisions for himself, realizing that love is what is important to him, asking him to actually find the one he loves rather than marrying for the sake of monarchies and other royal stuff. It is a more impactful moment that showcases the love of family, and it works even more emotionally for the audience to understand him as a character, contrasting with the kindness and courage themes of the movie. This whole scene greatly reflects on the story more and how you actually can add to it, very similar to the original Cinderella and Little Mermaid, where two people are actually helping each other out while falling in love, seeking something greater for the messages and themes that their families presented to them. Something that the Little Mermaid remake never understood to prop up Ariel instead, while forgetting what was actually important. This moment actually understood what was needed out of the characters from the original and brought it out for the audience to see that change that is being justified rather than empowering the main character more. You just feel for him in the moment and his love where he passes now, and Kit becomes the king of the land, setting out to find the girl he loves to continue the legacy of both his parents. This announcement leads Ella to get her slipper, knowing she has the chance to see him again and live free from her abusive family, but at the same time, Lady Tremaine also finds out about the truth that she went, explaining her bitterness of Ella's beauty and how she lost what she loved in her husband, and of course Ella's father, leaving her with the one that takes everything from her, and her daughters, where she actually admits are ugly and stupid, trying now to blackmail the pretty woman to get what she wants, wanting control over the royal household and virtually the king in that way. Of course, she refuses in the situation because that is something she does not want to be true, knowing her character, where she then forces to lock her up in the attic and breaks the slippers so that she could keep her where she needs to be and try to get what she wants out of her life, presenting this to the Grand Duke so they can both benefit from the situation to become a countess, keeping Ella locked away so that he can have a marriage to benefit the kingdom politically. This forces the king no choice but to agree to the situation to marry a princess, as they cannot find her throughout the kingdom, but it goes through this process of the infamous slipper. And I like how they paint the scene as hopeless for Ella and whatnot as the search goes on, where even though she may never see him again, she relishes in the memory of that night and her parents, leading herself with the same courage and kindness as always, where the mice open up that opportunity, demonstrating the importance without overly relying them as CG characters. This reveals to us of the third maiden they've been searching for, while the Grand Duke and Lady Tremaine try to hide this as much as possible, while also revealing that the king had been there the whole time, considering that he wants to find her rather than being reserved for most of the film and doing anything with that, showing how much his guards trust him to do this and adding to his character and his choices to find Ella instead of just having him getting married at the end, where it is the final moment for her character where she's allowed freedom by the captain, where Lady Tremaine tries to establish her authority for the very last time for any grip she has on her character as her mom, but then again we see her retort by saying this:
"You have never been, and you never will be my mother."
It's the final moment that settles her character's journey by breaking free from her abusiveness and leading her own life. A very great empowering moment for her character that is done right considering all the rest of the remakes. She then also at the very moment meets Kit and of course gets to be the one to do it and confirm that it's her all along. It's already clear to us that he knows it will fit, and it's one mainly to show that she probably accepts her name as Cinderella as well. It's this arc that actually shows that she accepts what she went through in her life, embracing all of her flaws and still carrying on strong in the name of her parents, where they accept each other as who they are in their heart at the very end. And the final moment shows she forgives Lady Tremaine for what she done, knowing that she is free from her, and so are they. Or of course, they're finally forced out of the kingdom at the end. And like the original, it finally shows them to be married, showcasing the tribute to both their parents at the end, completing their very character's arc. This also reminds us at the very end that being kind and having courage is where all will be well eventually, panning out to show us the shot of them being cheered by the royal subjects accepting King Kit and Cinderella, ending the the movie beautifully for what it was. So as we could see, this movie really did accomplish what no other remake did after, changing the story to be better rather than removing what already worked. It added more substance to the film without ruining, making it stand out on its own to adapt the story in this sort of form, which is something Disney does not understand anymore. As you can see, despite my irrational hatred for these films, they still prove that they can work and have an enjoyable time as long as they understand what a live action film can do for it, making it better and real as they should be. It's just now unfortunate that they have proved their worth at times, but then rely on things that never needed to be done to make their stories more modern and up to date, and virtually suck as a result. And thinking back on this, I really don't think they would ever try to make that ever again if The Little Mermaid is anything to go by right now, or even the Peter Pan film of this very year. They never get it and they never will, and they won't invest the time in actual stories that can work in this very medium, much like Cinderella, Jungle Book, or possibly what an Atlantis film could do for him, where they would just continue to suffer as a result, unfortunately. And with that said, this has been my look at Cinderella being the best reimagining to do so until the end of time. So I'm all done. Goodbye.